Linwood Tate woke before the sun, the way he had for 51 years, and the first thing his hands found in the dark was the strop hanging by the back door. He did not turn on the overhead light. He never did in the workshop. He liked the gray hour, the one that came up slow through the single window over the bench, the one that let a man see the grain of a hide before he saw anything else. He pulled the cord on the little gooseneck lamp, and the cone of yellow fell across a square of vegetable-tanned leather. He had been working since Tuesday. He sat. He ran his thumb along the edge of the cut, feeling for the place where it would want to fold. 40 years he had been making things out of leather, and still the first thing he trusted was his thumb. On the bench, to the right of the cutting mat, lay a leather stitching awl with a worn rosewood handle. The brass collar had gone dull and soft-cornered from handling. It had belonged to his father, Eli, who had run a shoe and boot repair shop on Dunmore Street on the north side of St. Louis from 1948 until the day his heart quit on him in the back room, half a heel still clamped in the vise. Linwood did not use the oil for real work anymore. He had machines for that now, in 11 plants across 4 states, but he kept it on the bench, in the light where he could see it. This morning he picked it up. He turned it over once, set it back down, and got to work. What he was making was a small thing, a leather case, hand-stitched, the size to hold a single pair of reading glasses. It was for his daughter. Camille was getting married that afternoon, and Linwood had asked her, weeks ago, what she wanted from him, and she had said, in that way she had of meaning it lightly, so it would land soft. Just come, Daddy. Just come and be you. So he was bringing himself, and he was bringing this, because a man did not show up to his only child's wedding with empty hands. He stitched the last seam by hand, 2 needles and a waxed thread, the saddle stitch his father had taught him before he could read. When he finished, he pressed the seam flat with a bone folder and held the case up to the lamp and turned it. Even, quiet, the kind of work nobody noticed because it was done right. He laid a square of folded paper inside it. On the paper, in his own slow hand, he had written one line. The stitch no one sees is the one that holds the boot together. His father had said that to him 1,000 times, usually with a mouthful of tacks, usually about something other than boots. Linwood folded the case closed, wrapped the whole of it in a soft cloth, and tied it with a length of the same waxed thread. Then he went and pressed his jacket. It was a corduroy sport coat, brown wide wale, the elbows starting to shine. He had owned it 11 years. The boots he put on he had made himself in the 2nd year of the company, back when he still made every prototype with his own hands, and they had been resoled twice and would be resoled again. He looked at himself in the mirror by the door for about as long as it took to straighten his collar. And then he stopped looking, because there was nothing in the mirror he needed. 60 miles west, in the wine country outside Augusta, Missouri, a different morning was happening. The Vereen Hollow vineyard sat on a south-facing slope where the rows of Norton vines had gone the deep red of October, and the air smelled of crushed fruit and oak and money. A team in black had been there since 5, and by noon the lawn below the tasting house held 180 white chairs set in rows so straight a surveyor could have signed off on them. There was a string trio in the corner. There was a champagne fountain. There were calla lilies flown in from somewhere, and a wedding planner named Delphine moving down the aisle with a level app on her phone, checking that the chairs agreed with each other. The guest list read like the back pages of a regional business journal. Fund managers, a bank president, 2 developers. The men wore their watches turned slightly inward so you had to work to see them. Camille's side of the family was smaller, and they had been seated toward the back, near the trellis, where the speakers were thinnest. No one had argued about it. It had simply been arranged that way, the morning the seating chart was finalized by the groom. Preston Vance was 35 years old, with a swimmer's shoulders and a jaw that photographed well, and a smile he could turn on like a faucet. On paper, he was exactly what the afternoon was meant to advertise. He was a principal at Ashby Lane Partners, a private equity shop downtown, and for 14 months he had been chasing the largest deal of his career, a $200 million play to take a position in a privately held manufacturer he had never once set foot inside. He talked about it the way some men talk about a horse they have money on. Dunmore Industries, he was saying now, to a knot of men by the champagne fountain, an hour before the ceremony, a glass already in his hand. $3.5 billion in revenue, and the family won't even take a meeting. Run by some board and a CEO and a chairman nobody's laid eyes on in a decade. I've got it about closed, he sipped. Whoever the old man is who owns the thing, he's smart enough to stay invisible. I'll give him that. The men laughed the way men laugh when a deal is being described. Preston had told Camille, back in the spring, to keep her side of the list manageable. He had told her gently that her father did not need to give a toast. It's a long program already, babe. He had told her more than once that the day was about the future and not the past. Camille had loved him, or had told herself the thing she felt was love. And she had kept the peace, and she had not told him everything about her father. Some of that was her own caution. Some of it was that Linwood had asked her, years ago, not to. Let people meet me before they meet the company, he'd said. You learn a lot in that order. Preston had never met him. He had seen one photograph on Camille's phone, 2 years old and out of focus. To Preston, the father of the bride was a retired tradesman from the North Side who, as far as he understood it, did something with leather goods. The cab, no, it was no cab. It was a Ford F-150 with 18 years on it and a bed liner cracked white at the corners, turned off the county road and came up the gravel drive at 4:15. A young man in a black vest stepped forward to take it. He was maybe 19, lean, with a name tag that read Deontay and a community college parking permit on a lanyard tucked into his pocket. He opened the driver's door before Linwood had the engine off, and when Linwood climbed down, careful of his knee, the boy said, "Afternoon, sir. I'll keep her right up close for you." And Linwood looked at him, really looked, the way he looked at a seam, and said, "Thank you, son. What is you studying?" And the boy blinked, because nobody had asked him that all day, and said, "HVAC nights." And Linwood nodded like that was a fine and serious thing, because it was. Then Linwood walked toward the tasting house with the cloth-wrapped gift under his arm, and the afternoon turned. The first look hit him before he reached the flagstones. A woman in pearls touched her husband's sleeve. The husband looked away, looked again, the small double-take people do when something in the picture does not match the frame. Linwood kept walking. He had felt that look in 100 rooms over 64 years, and he had long ago decided it cost him nothing to keep his feet moving. He came up the steps and through the open doors into the cool of the tasting house, and 3 strides in, he stopped, because Preston Vance was already coming at him. Not walking. Crossing the room fast, glass set down somewhere behind him, the faucet smile shut off. Up close, the man smelled of good champagne and something tighter underneath it. "Sir." Preston pitched his voice low, but the trio had paused between pieces and low carried. "Sir, I think you've got the wrong event. The food bank collection. That's the church down on Route 94. This is a private wedding." A few faces near the bar turned. Linwood held the wrapped gift against his chest, one hand flat over it. "I'm Camille's father," he said. His voice came out level and unhurried, the voice he used with men who had not yet realized they were standing in his shop. For a half-second something flickered across Preston's face, and then he laughed, short, and looked Linwood up and down. The shining elbows, the resoled boots, the gift tied with thread. Camille's father. He said it the way you'd repeat a wrong answer back to a child. "Of course you are." He did not say the rest. He didn't need to. He let his eyes do it, traveling once more from the boots to the collar, and then he half-turned and lifted 2 fingers toward a pair of men in dark suits, standing near the entrance. "Gentlemen, could you help this man find his way back out? I think he's lost." The younger of the 2 security men hesitated. He looked at Linwood's face and saw something there he did not have a word for, and what he said was, "Maybe we ought to check with the bride first, Mr. Vance." "I didn't ask you to check anything," Preston said, pleasant final. "I asked you to walk him to his vehicle." Linwood did not raise his voice. He did not raise anything. His right hand had drifted into the pocket of the corduroy coat, and inside it his thumb had found the old awl. He carried it some days, the way other men carried a coin, and he closed his fingers around the worn rosewood and held himself. And that was anyone saw, an old man going very still. "It's all right," he said quietly to the young security man, sparing him the choice. "I'll see myself out." He turned and he walked. His boots came down even on the wide plank floor, one and then the other, and the sound of them was the loudest thing in the room. Behind him the trio lifted their bows and started in again, something in 3/4 time, as if nothing had happened, as if a man had not just been walked toward the door of his daughter's wedding. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a soft, expensive sigh. Outside, the light had gone gold and long across the vines. Linwood stood a moment on the flagstones, the gift still against his chest, and breathed the smell of the fruit. The boy in the black vest was there at the bottom of the steps, uncertain, half a step forward and half a step back. "Sir, you all right? You want me to bring the truck around?" "In a minute, son." Linwood went and sat on a low stone wall at the edge of the lawn, set the gift on his knee, and looked back at the building for a while, the way a man looks at a wall he built to see if it's still plumb. Then he took out his phone. He scrolled past a great many names. Names a person would know from a newspaper, names from a board, names from a State of the Union audience once, years ago, and he did not call any of them. He pressed one. He put it to his ear and waited. "Gwen," he said, "it's Linwood." A pause while the gold light moved on the vines. "Yeah, he did exactly what you said he'd do." Another pause. He looked down at the cloth-wrapped case on his knee, at the thread he'd tied it with that morning. "No, I'm not going to make a scene." His thumb moved over the thread. "But I believe it's time," he found out. "Come on up to the vineyard. And Gwen, bring yourself, that's all. Just come as you are." He hung up. He slid the phone back into the coat, next to the awl, and he sat in the long October light and waited. A red-tailed hawk was working the thermals over the far rows, tilting, holding, tilting, and he watched it the way he watched anything that knew how to do one thing well. Up in the bridal suite on the second floor of the tasting house, Camille Tate was standing very still, while a woman she'd met that morning pinned a strand of jasmine back into her hair, and she was thinking that she did not feel like a bride. She felt like a centerpiece, beautiful, placed, and faintly afraid of being moved wrong. Her maid of honor caught it first, the buzz of a phone on the vanity. Tamara Boyd had known Camille since the 7th grade, since the year both their families had moved within a block of each other on the north side, and she was the only person in the wedding party who had said to Camille's face, more than once, that something about Preston did not sit right. She glanced at the screen. Her hands went quiet in the air. "Cam." She read it again to be sure. "Your dad just got walked out." Camille turned from the mirror so fast the jasmine pulled loose. "What?" "Security walked him out. Just now. My cousin's downstairs. She texted me. Said Preston told them he had the wrong event." Tamara's jaw was tight. Said something about a food bank. The color left Camille's face in stages, top to bottom, like a window going dark. She set one hand flat on the vanity. Her knuckles paled. "No, he wouldn't. He's never met my father. Cam, he did." For a moment, Camille did not move at all. Then she reached up, took the rest of the jasmine out of her hair herself, one pin at a time, set them in a neat row on the glass, and said, in a voice that had gone very even, "Help me with the train. I'm going down." The hallway outside the suite was where Preston's mother was waiting, because Margot Vance had a way of being wherever a thing was about to go sideways, the better to manage how it landed. She was 61, silver and slim, with a face that had the smoothness of a person who had never once said "I'm sorry" and meant it. She put a cool hand on Camille's bare arm. "There you are now," she smiled. "These things happen at large events. Some confusion at the door, I understand." Preston handled it. Marrying across, well, she let the sentence find its own ending and patted Camille's arm. "It just brings a little extra to manage, that's all. Nothing we can't smooth over." Camille looked at the hand on her arm until Margot removed it. "He walked my father out of my wedding," she said. "There's nothing to smooth." She went down the back stairs and through the side door into the long hall behind the bar, And that was where she found Preston, straightening his cuffs, wearing the small, satisfied look of a man who has tidied something up. "Babe." He brightened, then took in her face the loose hair the train gathered in one fist. Hey, what's wrong? We're on in 30. You walked my father out." Around them, the catering staff found sudden reasons to be elsewhere. Preston lowered his voice and stepped close, and there was a warmth in it that was somehow worse than shouting. "Babe, listen." An older gentleman came in off the road in work clothes, no invitation that anybody could find, carrying a parcel. The man looked like he'd wandered up from a job site. "I protected the day, I protected you. You'll see it different tomorrow." That was my father. Something moved behind Preston's eyes and was put away. "Then he should have called ahead," he said, "or dressed for his daughter's wedding. I had 180 people watching, the Hartwells, the whole Ashby table. Do the arithmetic, Camille. $425,000, and a man shows up looking like he came to read the gas meter? No. I wasn't going to have it." Camille's lips trembled, and not from grief, from something colder and clearer. "You don't even know who he is," she said. Preston rolled his eyes, gentle, indulgent, the way you'd correct a child who'd gotten a fact wrong. "I know enough. I know a man who couldn't put on a decent suit for this. That tells me the whole story." "No," Camille shook her head slowly. "It tells you nothing. Not one thing." And she turned and went back up the stairs, and behind her Preston called her name twice. "Low, don't make a scene," and she did not stop. Down the hall, near a service door propped open to the loading lane, the best man had found the only person at the wedding. He could think of nothing better to do than bother. Brent Mosley had gone 3 bourbons past cents and 0 past his true tature. He'd cornered Tamara by a tray of untouched canapes, and Tamara, who had come down for ice and stayed for reasons of her own, was letting him talk, because there are men who tell you exactly who they are if you give them 30 unbroken seconds. "You're on the bride's side, right?" Brent said. "Gotta be nice, getting to see a place like Verine Hollow." He swirled his glass. "Don't imagine you get a lot of this where you're from." Tamara set her water down. "And where am I from? I'm just saying. Different worlds, you know. Some folks just know how to carry themselves at a thing like this. Some folks," he gestured vaguely toward the front of the house, toward the doors, "you can just tell they don't really belong. No shade. It's a breeding thing." In her clutch, Tamara's phone had been recording since the word imagine. He did not notice. He was laughing at his own line. "Keep going," she said, sweet as a closing door. "I want to make sure I've got this." She did not need to push him. He went on for another 40 seconds, and every one of them landed clean on the little microphone. And when he finally wandered off toward the bar, she stood there a moment looking after him. And what she was thinking about was a number she'd read once and never been able to shake. That of the 500 largest companies in America. The count of black chief executives running them at any one time could be tallied on 2 hands, and some years not even that. A handful of names against the whole of a country. She'd thought about it because of who her best friend's father was. Brent had no idea he was standing in the long shadow of exactly the kind of exception the number existed to embarrass. Outside, the gold had deepened to amber, and the first of the evening cool was coming off the vine rows. Linwood was still on the stone wall when a car door shut behind him and footsteps came across the grass, and he didn't have to turn to know it was Yvette. She'd been his wife once, a long time ago, back before any of it, and they had stayed something to each other on the far side of the divorce, the way 2 people can who built a child together and never managed to stop respecting one another even after the marriage gave out. She lowered herself onto the wall beside him, in her good dress, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She was shaking, just slightly, and it was not the cold. "I told her," Yvette said finally. "I told Camille that boy was all polish. I told her there was no floor under him." Linwood looked at the vines. "You did. That man put his hands on you in front of." Her voice caught. "Linwood, he had them walk you out. Because of how you were dressed. Because of—" She stopped, because the rest of it was a thing they both knew and neither of them ever said out loud at a wedding. "It's not about the coat, Yvette." Linwood turned the wrapped gift over once on his knee. It never is. It's about what a person lets you see when he's decided you can't do a single thing to him. That's the only honest look you ever get from some people. The rest is manners. He was quiet a moment. I'm almost grateful for it. You can't trust a man until you've seen him be sure he's safe. And now, he said, we wait a few minutes. And here is the thing Preston Vance did not know. The thing nobody at the front of that house knew, sitting in their straight white chairs above the river of vines. 39 years before, Linwood Tate had been 25 years old and full of more want than sense, working the bench in his father's shop on Dunmore Street. The repair trade was dying around them. The factories on the north side were laying men off by the hundred, and a man getting laid off does not get his boots resoled. He buys cheap and wears them through and buys cheap again. Eli Tate could see the end of his own trade coming up the road, and he kept stitching anyway, slow and careful, because it was the only thing he knew how to do well. Linwood saw something else. He saw the men coming off the loading docks and out of the rail yards with their feet wrecked by boots built for a showroom and not for a 12-hour shift on concrete and steel. He started making a work boot in the back of his father's shop. Steel shank, oil-tanned upper, a sole he stitched, instead of glued, built for the man who stood all day and meant to stand all day tomorrow. He sold the first dozen pair off the back of a truck outside the gate of a brewery. He sold the next 40 inside a month. He drove the routes himself for 3 years, slept some nights in the truck, ate from gas station coolers, and built the thing with his own 2 hands, and a stubbornness that bordered on a sickness. That boot became a line. The line became a factory. The factory became Dunmore Industries, named for the street, for the shop, for the man with a mouthful of tacks, who had taught him that the stitch nobody sees is the one that holds the whole boot together. They made safety footwear now, and flame-resistant workwear, and the gloves and the hard hats and the high-visibility gear that a few million working Americans put on in the dark every morning the way Linwood put on his boots. $3.5 billion in revenue, 11 plants, 40-odd years. 11 years ago, Linwood had stepped back, quietly, with no announcement and no farewell dinner. He'd put the company in the hands of a board and a CEO he trusted with his life. A woman named Gwen Price, who had started on the line as a stitcher at 19 and outworked every man who ever doubted her. And he had moved back to the old neighborhood, into a small house 6 blocks from where the shop had stood, and bought nothing he didn't need. He drove the F-150. He ate breakfast at the same diner on Salisbury where the waitress called him on, and did not know his net worth from a hole in the ground. He did it on purpose. He had not wanted Camille to grow up inside a bubble, defined by a number, loved for what her father owned instead of who he was. The ownership ran through the Tate family trust. The founder's name was buried 3 layers down in legal filings that no associate at a firm like Ashby Lane would ever bother to read, because why would you read past the operating board to find a retired old man on the north side of St. Louis? You wouldn't. Preston hadn't. He had spent 14 months trying to buy a piece of a company built by the man he just had walked to his truck. On the stone wall, Yvette wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and looked at him sidelong. You knew. When she got engaged, you knew where that boy worked, what he was chasing. I knew, and you let it go this far. Linwood was quiet for a while. Down the slope, the lights had begun to come up around the lawn, warm against the failing day. And you could hear, faintly, the trio start in on something meant for a processional. I wanted to see who he'd be, he said at last. Before he knew who I was, people show you twice, Yvette. Once when they think you're nobody, and once when they find out you're not. I've already seen the first one. He stood slowly, mindful of the knee, and tucked the wrapped gift back under his arm. Across the grass, headlights were turning in off the county road and coming up the gravel drive, a plain dark sedan taking its time. Now, he said, I'd like to see the second. The dark sedan came to a stop at the foot of the drive, well back from the row of German cars, and a woman got out who did not look like she had hurried, though she had. Gwen Price was 56 years old and built like someone who had spent the first part of her life on her feet. She wore a charcoal suit, well cut and unshowy, and flat shoes she could stand in for 10 hours, because 40 years on she still dressed for a shift. She had started on the Dunmore line as a stitcher at 19, in the same plant whose boots she now signed off on by the 100,000. And there was nothing in any boardroom that frightened her, because she had literally survived being the only woman, and then the only black woman, in rooms that had made very sure she knew it. She crossed the grass to the stone wall. She did not embrace Linwood, that was not what they were to each other. But she stood in front of him a moment, and what she said was, "You all right?" "I'm fine, Gwen." "You don't look fine. You look like a man who got walked out of his own girl's wedding." She glanced up the slope at the lit house. "Which is what I hear happened." "I'm fine," he said again, and she heard the difference between the 2 times he said it, and let it go. "All right. You want to tell me how you'd like to play it?" Linwood looked at the building for a while. Through the tall windows you could see the warm shapes of the guests beginning to move from the lawn toward the doors, gathering in, the way people do before a thing starts. "I don't want to humiliate anybody," he said. "I've been humiliated. It's a poor thing to hand somebody else." "That's not what I asked." "No," a small, tired smile. "I'd just like to walk back in. And I'd like my name to come in with me, since it seems to matter so much in there." He looked at her. "You're on the list, you know. Vance sent the invitation himself, 3 months ago, to the CEO of Dunmore Industries. He's been trying to get a meeting with you for a year. He just thought the wedding was the side door." Gwen made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He invited me here to close me." "He did. Then I expect," she said, smoothing the front of her charcoal jacket, "I ought to go in and accept the invitation." Up in the suite, Camille had not gone back to the mirror. She was sitting on the edge of the chaise with her train pooled on the floor, and Tamara was sitting beside her, and on the low table between them was a folder Tamara had pulled from Camille's overnight bag. The folder Camille had been carrying for 2 weeks without opening again, because opening it made her stomach drop. It was the prenuptial agreement. Preston's family lawyer had drawn it up in August and walked her through it in a downtown conference room. Fast, warm, all reassurance, standard protections. Just paperwork. Everybody does this. Sign here, and we'll never think about it again. She'd signed. She was a high school teacher marrying into money, and she hadn't wanted to look like she was marrying into money. So she'd signed without bringing her own attorney, which was the first thing Tamara had said was a mistake. "Read me the part again," Camille said. "The one you circled." Tamara found it. Page 9, a clause buried under a heading about marital property and separate business interests, in language built to be skimmed past. What it said, once you slowed down and read it the way you'd read a contract instead of a love letter, was this: in the event of a divorce, any business interest, trust distribution, or inheritance that came to Camille from her family during the marriage would be treated as a shared asset, divisible, and Preston's share would be figured from the gross value, before debts, not the net. There was a second clause, quieter still, that gave Preston's side the right to compel a full accounting of any trust in which his wife held a beneficial interest. Camille had read it in August and decided it was lawyer boilerplate she didn't entirely follow. She understood it now, sitting in a wedding dress with her father out on a stone wall in the cold. "He doesn't know who my father is," she said slowly. But somebody on his side wondered. Somebody drew this up thinking, what if she's worth more than she looks? Her voice had gone very flat. "They didn't write this for me. They wrote it for whatever I might be sitting on. Cam." Tamara closed the folder. "You don't have to figure all that out tonight." "No." Camille stood, and her face had moved past anger into something clear and almost calm. "But I'm not going to sign my father into a footnote in some man's settlement. Help me with the train." Inside, Preston Vance was running the room the way he ran everything, which was beautifully and with one eye on the exits. He had told the guests there'd been a small mix-up at the door, a confused gentleman, a misunderstanding all sorted. He moved through the gathering crowd with a fresh glass and a hand for every shoulder, and the version of the afternoon he was selling was taking, mostly, because people at weddings want to be sold to. His father had found him near the head of the aisle. Sterling Vance was 70 silver, soft-spoken in the way of men who have always had others to raise their voices for them, and what he said, without moving his lips much, was, "The Hartwells are seated. The Ashby people are watching how you carry this. Pour wine, make it small. It's small, Dad. Make it smaller." That was when the front doors opened, not gently, not the discreet sliding in of a late guest, but pushed wide both leaves with the flat confidence of someone who had been invited and knew it. Gwen Price walked in alone. It started at the table nearest the door. A man half rose, gripped his wife's wrist. "That's honey, isn't that?" And then the next table caught it, and the one past that, the recognition moving back through the room like wind crossing the vine rows. She'd been on the cover of a trade magazine that every man in that room subscribed to and pretended to read. She'd been interviewed on the business channel that played in all their lobbies. The CEO of Dunmore Industries, $3.5 billion here. Preston heard the name before he understood it. Price, Gwen Price, Dunmore. His pulse jumped. Not with alarm, not yet, with something closer to delight, because this was the gift of a lifetime, the deal walking in the front door on the best night of his year. He set his glass down. He shot his cuffs. He fixed on the smile he kept for quarterly reviews and crossed the room toward her with his hand already out. "Mrs. Price. Preston Vance. Ashby Lane. I can't tell you what an honor. We've been trying to find time on your calendar for—" Gwen did not take his hand. His fingers hung in the air between them. 1 second. 2. Long enough for the people nearest to notice, and then for the people past them to notice the people noticing. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance," Gwen said. Her voice was not loud. She had never needed loud. "But I'm not here for you." The smile on Preston's face did something complicated. I'm sorry?" She didn't repeat herself. She turned, a quarter turn, away from him and toward the open doors, and she raised one hand toward them, palm up, and she waited. For a moment the doorway held nothing but the blue of the evening behind it. Then Linwood Tate walked back in. Same corduroy coat with the shining elbows, same resoled boots, same cloth-wrapped gift held against his chest, but he did not come in the way he'd gone out. His shoulders had come down off his ears. His chin was level. He walked the way a man walks across a floor, he poured himself, and the boots came down even and unhurried, one and then the other, and the sound of them in the silence was the only sound there was. Gwen waited until he had come to a stop beside her. Then she turned to face the room. 180 people, every eye on the two of them standing together in the doorway of a wedding that had tried, an hour ago, to put one of them out with the trash. "For those of you who don't know him," she said, and let it sit. "And it's plain that some of you don't." She didn't rush it. "This is Linwood Tate." The name landed on most of them as nothing at all, a beat of puzzled quiet. "He's the founder of Dunmore Industries. He built the company I run. He owns the controlling interest in it through his family's trust, and he has since, before most of the people in this room could have told you what a safety boot was." A fork slipped off a plate somewhere near the back and rang once against the floor. "He's the chairman of our board." Gwen turned her head, unhurried, and looked directly at Preston Vance. "And as I understand it, he's the father of the bride." The silence did not break. It dropped the way a floor drops out from under you. Somewhere to the left, a champagne flute slid out of a hand that had stopped working, Margot Vance's hand, and burst on the flagstone, and she did not look down at it. Her fingers stayed frozen in the shape of the glass that was no longer in them. Sterling Vance's mouth had come open, the careful, soft-spoken mouth, and nothing was coming out of it. At the bar, Brent Mosley's bourbon had stopped halfway up, the ice ticking against the glass because his hand had begun, very slightly, to shake. The Ashby Lane people at their table exchanged one look, the particular look of men calculating how quietly they can leave a building, and Preston went white. Not pale. White. The way a wall is white, the color draining off his face from the hairline down so fast it looked like something medical. His lips moved. No sound came. He took a step back, and his heel caught the edge of the aisle runner, and he put a hand out and found the back of a chair, and the chair leg shrieked across the plank floor, and the noise of it made the whole room flinch as one body. Linwood did not gloat. He did not point. He crossed the floor until he was perhaps 10 feet from Preston and stopped, the wrapped gift still in his two hands. "I didn't come here to do this," he said, quietly. It was worse, quiet. "I came to watch my daughter get married, to give her this." He looked down at the cloth-wrapped case in his hands as if he'd half forgotten it was there. "You walked up to me an hour ago, and you looked at my coat and my boots, and you decided you knew everything you needed to know. You didn't ask my name." His eyes came up. "You didn't ask the woman you're about to marry what her father's name was. You looked at me and you decided I wasn't anybody. That's the only thing you got wrong tonight, son. But you got it all the way wrong." "Mr. Tate," Preston's voice came out, cracked, scraped thin. "Sir, I had no idea who I know you didn't." Linwood's voice stayed level, almost gentle, which made it land harder. "That's the whole of it. If you'd known, you'd have carried my coat for me yourself. The man you walked out the door and the man you've been chasing for 14 months are the same man. You just couldn't see him under the corduroy." He turned, set the wrapped gift down on the nearest table, gently, the way you set something that took you 2 days to make, and beside it, from his coat pocket, he took the old leather awl with the worn rosewood handle and laid it down too in the warm light, next to where the centerpiece threw its shine. He didn't explain it. He just set it there, his father's tool, in a room full of men who measured everything by its price, and for a moment it was the plainest object in the building, and somehow the one your eye went to. That was when Camille came down. She came down the open staircase into the hall in her ivory gown, with the train gathered in one fist, her hair half undone, where she'd taken the jasmine out herself, her face washed clean of everything but resolve. She came past the guests and the lilies and the champagne fountain that no one was drinking from anymore. And she stopped in front of Preston, and she did not raise her voice. "I gave you every chance," she said, "to love my family for who they are, not for what they turned out to have." She reached up and worked the ring off her finger. 4 carats, and it caught the chandelier once on the way down. And she set it on the table beside the awl, the two of them lying there together in the light, the diamond and the tool, and you could see, if you were looking, which one her father had made with his hands. "The wedding's off, Preston." She crossed to her father and took his arm, and the two of them walked back out through the same wide doors that security had walked him through an hour before, the corduroy and the ivory side by side, and not one of the 180 people in that room said a word or moved to stop them. The doors swung shut behind them. Behind, in the ringing quiet, Preston stood with his hand still on the back of the chair. His father reached him, gripped his elbow hard, and put his silver head close, and the thing Sterling Vance said, low fast, only for his son, was not let it go. It was, "This is not finished. Do you understand me? This does not get to be how it ends." The story did not end in the parking lot of Verine Hollow, the way the people driving home that night assumed it would. Those people were thinking about a wedding. Sterling Vance was thinking about a balance sheet. And the difference between those two things is the difference between an ending and the start of the worst part. Within a week, 2 facts about the Vance family came loose that had been held together, until then, by appearances and the patience of 3 different banks. The first was the deal. By the following Tuesday, Ashby Lane Partners had been informed, through Gwen Price's office in a single courteous paragraph, that Dunmore Industries was no longer entertaining any outside position from Ashby Lane or anyone Ashby Lane represented, and that all prior correspondence should be considered closed. $200 million of other people's money that Preston had spent 14 months steering toward that one shore simply evaporated, and with it the carried interest he had already privately spent in his head. By Friday, the partners had taken his name off the deal he'd built and, in the gentle, bloodless language of such firms, transitioned him out of his role to pursue other opportunities. The second fact was older and uglier, and it explained the first one in a way nobody outside the family had understood until it surfaced. The Vances were broke. Not broke the way ordinary people are broke the way the rich go broke, slowly and then all at once, behind walls. The house in Ladue had been refinanced twice. Sterling's own fund had been quietly bleeding for 3 years, kept upright by Preston's promised commission on the Dunmore deal, a commission everyone in the family had been spending against before it existed. Margot standing at the club, the cars turned inward at the wrist, the $425,000 wedding paid for on a line of credit against a thing that no longer existed. All of it had been a performance staged over a hole. Preston had needed that deal the way a drowning man needs the surface. He had not insulted Linwood Tate because he could afford to. He had done it because he was terrified all the time that someone would look at him the way he looked at the old man in the corduroy coat and see what was actually there. He had thrown the first stone he could find at the nearest person who couldn't. He was sure throw one back. He had been wrong about who could throw one back. And now he had nothing left to lose, which is the most dangerous thing a small man can have. He did not disappear. That was what Linwood had half expected, and half hoped, that the Vances would do what people of their kind usually did, close the Drapeses and wait out the news cycle. Instead, about 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, the first attack came, and it did not come at Linwood's wealth, because, as Preston had finally understood, he could not touch that. It came at the only things Linwood had ever actually loved. It started online. A 30-second clip surfaced on a few local pages, footage someone had taken on a phone in the tasting house, edited down to its cruelest shape. It showed Linwood setting the awl on the table next to Camille's discarded ring, and over it ran a caption that had been written to wound: "Billionaire humiliates struggling young exec at family wedding, flexes net worth in front of 180 guests." The clip cut before Preston's own words, before any of it, so that a stranger scrolling past at a red light saw only a powerful old man and a broken young one. It was a lie built entirely out of true footage, which is the hardest kind to kill. Then a reporter at a regional weekly, one Sterling had golfed with for 15 years, ran a piece asking hard questions about Dunmore's plans for the North Side. Linwood had, for 2 years, been quietly buying back parcels along Dunmore Street, the dying block where his father's shop had stood, with the intention of putting something there. The article reframed it: an out-of-touch billionaire buying up a struggling neighborhood, long-time residents' fear displacement, the word gentrification set in the headline like a hook. It quoted no residents by name. It didn't need to. The shape of the thing was the point. And then, 2 days before the city was to issue the construction permits, the permits stalled. This was the part that had Sterling Vance's fingerprints on it, though you'd never prove it on paper. A zoning subcommittee that had nodded the project through in the spring suddenly discovered concerns: a traffic study, a question about the historic character of the corridor, a procedural objection raised by a newly formed neighborhood association whose mailing address turned out, when Tamara dug into it, to be a UPS box rented the month before. The project Linwood had spent 2 years and $18 million assembling, a trades training center, free, on the lot where Eli Tate had stitched boots for 40 years, sat frozen while a man who had been broke for 3 years made phone calls to people who still owed him favors. And then came the lawsuit, which was the cleverest and the cruelest of the three. A company nobody had heard of, registered in Delaware 6 weeks earlier, filed suit against Dunmore Industries for patent infringement. The patent in question covered a particular construction of a dormant cushioning sole, an old, half-abandoned design, the kind of thing that sits in a portfolio for years doing nothing. The shell company had bought it cheap, and now claimed that Dunmore's newest work boot, the Eli line, named for Linwood's father and set to launch the same month the training center was meant to open, infringed it. The suit asked for an injunction. It asked the court to stop Dunmore from making the boot named for the dead man whose tools sat on Linwood's workbench. It would not win. Gwen's lawyers said so within a week, after they traced the shell company's funding through 2 more shells and found, at the bottom of it, a small remaining pool of Sterling Vance's money, and a signature that belonged to a man who had recently transitioned out of his role to pursue other opportunities. But winning was never the point. The point was to tie up the launch, freeze the permit, run the clip, stack the three of them on top of each other, so that a tired city would decide the whole North Side project was more trouble than it was worth and quietly let it die. There was one more thing the lawyers found, and it was the piece that told Linwood the whole scheme had started long before the wedding. When Camille filed to formally void the engagement, the firm reviewed the prenuptial agreement she'd signed in August, and they read page 9 the way Tamara had read it that night in the suite, slowly, as a contract and not a courtesy. The clause that turned family trust distributions into divisible marital assets figured on the gross. The clause that let Preston's side compel an accounting of any trust in which she held an interest. The lawyers pulled the drafting history, and the drafting history was the tell. The first version of the agreement, dated in June, had contained none of it. The trust language had been added in a later revision, after a particular date in early summer, after Preston had spent an afternoon by his own emails, doing some digging on the side, just to be thorough. He hadn't known his future father-in-law owned Dunmore. He'd never gotten that far. But somebody on the Vance side had wondered, the way a man drowning wonders about every plank that floats by, whether the schoolteacher with the modest father might be sitting on something, and had quietly built a door into the contract to reach it if she was. The prenup hadn't been protection. It had been a net set in the water months before the vows, waiting to see what swam into it. The same fear that had Sterling refinancing the house in Ladue had Preston's lawyer adding clauses to a marriage in case the bride turned out to be worth dredging. They were going to find their way to the trust either way, Gwen said when she laid it out for Linwood at his kitchen table. Through her. They built the tunnel before they even knew there was a vault at the end of it. Linwood turned the awl over once and set it down. And if he'd married her not knowing and found out after, he didn't make it a question. Then you'd have spent the next 20 years watching a man manage his way toward your daughter's inheritance with a smile on, Gwen said. The wedding falling apart the way it did might have been the kindest thing that ever happened to her. She just had to live through it to know that. Camille saw what it was doing to her father before he said a word about it. She had taken a small apartment 20 minutes from his place, and she had come over on a Thursday to find him at the kitchen table, with the permit paperwork spread out and the awl beside it. Not working, just sitting, turning it over in his fingers. She taught now at a public career and technical high school on the South Side. She ran the building trades and small engine program, taught 17-year-olds to wire an outlet and weld a clean bead and respect their own hands, and she knew the look of a man carrying more weight than he'd admit to. "They're not coming after your money," she said, sitting down across from him. "They figured out they can't. So they came after the neighborhood and the boot and the center." She put her hand flat on the paperwork. "They came after the parts of you that aren't bulletproof, the parts that are just yours." "I know what they came after," Linwood said. "Then fight it the way you fight everything else, quietly. Let Gwen's lawyers bury it." He was quiet a moment, turning the awl. "The lawyers'll handle the lawsuit. That's a thing made of paper, and paper loses to better paper." He set the tool down. "But the permit and what they're saying about the block, that's not paper, baby. That's people deciding what they believe about an old man and his neighborhood. You don't win that in a courtroom. You win it where the people are." That weekend he went to find Dante. It took him 2 phone calls, the vineyard, then the company that staffed it, but he tracked the boy down at the community college, coming out of an evening HVAC lab with a rolled-up worksheet in his back pocket. Dante went stiff when he recognized the old man from the wedding, the one everybody was now arguing about online, and started to say something apologetic and unsure, but Linwood waved it off and asked him if he had 10 minutes and a cup of coffee in him. They sat in a diner near the campus, in a vinyl booth patched with a strip of silver tape along one seam. Linwood took the awl out of his coat and set it on the formica between them, the rosewood worn pale where 2 generations of thumbs had ridden it. "My father used this for 50 years, he said, "on this same street about 2 miles north of where we're sitting. He used to tell me the stitch nobody sees is the one that holds the whole boot together. He turned it so the lamp caught the dull brass. The pretty stitches on the outside, anybody can do those. They're for show. It's the ones underneath, the ones nobody's ever going to look at, that decide whether the thing falls apart the first hard mile. He looked up at the boy. Most of the people who built everything you're going to stand on tomorrow, you'll never know their names. They were a stitch nobody saw. I spent my whole life making boots for them. I'd like to spend what's left helping a few of them get seen. He didn't make a pitch. He just told the boy about the center that wasn't getting built. Free tuition, paid apprenticeships. A path that didn't end at a wage, but at owning a piece of the thing you helped build. And Dante listened the way a young man listens when somebody describes a door he didn't know was supposed to be open to him. "Why are you telling me this?" Dante said finally. "Because you opened my truck door when nobody else in that whole place would look at me," Linwood said. "And because I was 19 once, with grease under my nails, studying nights, and a man with a shop took 10 minutes to ask me what I was learning. He stood, left a 20 under the salt shaker for a $4 coffee, and picked up the awl. That's the only reason I'm anything at all. Somebody saw the stitch." He had not meant it as recruitment. But the country was short something like 500,000 skilled trades workers that year, and the men and women who did that work, the electricians and welders and machinists and HVAC techs holding up the actual physical world, were aging out faster than anyone was replacing them, and a young person coming out of a good apprenticeship could clear 60, 70,000 a year by 25, with no debt at all, and almost nobody was telling kids on the north side that this door existed. Linwood knew the numbers cold. He'd built $3.5 billion on the backs of people the numbers describe. He was not going to let a frightened, ruined man in a UPS box decide that the door stayed shut on Dunmore Street, so he did not fight quietly. He did the thing Preston Vance would never have predicted, because it was the opposite of how Preston understood the world to work. He asked for the meeting to be public. The hearing was held on a Tuesday night in the gymnasium of a middle school 4 blocks off Dunmore Street, because the zoning subcommittee's regular chambers downtown held 40 people, and nobody ever admitted who, had quietly arranged for this one to be moved somewhere that held 400. It filled. People came who had never been to a zoning hearing in their lives. They came in work clothes and church clothes and high-visibility vests straight off a shift. They came because the story had 2 shapes by then, the cruel one and the true one, and a neighborhood that had been talked about in the third person for 30 years had decided it wanted to be in the room when its own future got decided. The folding chairs ran out 40 minutes before the gavel. Men stood along the painted free-throw line with their arms crossed, and the place smelled of floor wax and coffee from a 30-cup urn somebody's church had carried in. Preston Vance came too. He sat in the 3rd row in a good suit that no longer fit the rest of his life, beside a lawyer he could not really afford, and he believed, right up until he didn't, that he was going to win. He had the clip, he had the article, he had the patent suit pending, and a neighborhood association on record opposing the project. He had spent his whole life in rooms where the man with the best prepared file walked out with what he came for. He did not understand that he had walked into a different kind of room. The subcommittee chair opened the floor for public comment, and the people who stood up to speak were not the ones the UPS Box Association had promised. A retired pipe fitter stood up and said he'd worn Dunmore boots for 31 years and never once had a sole come off, and that if Linwood Tate wanted to put a free trade school on the lot where the man's daddy used to fix his boots, the only question worth asking was how fast. A woman who ran a daycare 2 doors down stood up and said the empty lot had been a needle yard for a decade, and she'd take a school full of teenagers learning a trade over that any day of the week. One by one, the actual longtime residents, the ones the article had spoken for without speaking to, stood up and spoke for themselves, and the displacement narrative came apart in real time, because it had never been built out of anything but a headline and a rented mailbox. An old woman near the front took the microphone and didn't let go of it for a while. She said she'd lived on Dunmore Street for 51 years, that she'd bought her late husband's burial shoes from Eli Tate in 1979, and Eli had stitched a little cross into the tongue of each one for free because he knew the family, and that anybody trying to tell her the Tates were strangers come to push her out could come say it to her face. She sat down to a sound the gymnasium hadn't made all night. Not applause exactly, more like a long exhale, a room of people recognizing something true. Toward the back, a man in a UPS brown jacket who'd signed the neighborhood association paperwork without reading it, stood up and said plainly that he'd been told it was about traffic, that nobody had mentioned any of this, and that he'd like his name taken off it. He left while he was still saying it. Then Tamara Boyd asked to be heard, and she did two things. She played, for the record, 40 seconds of audio recorded at a wedding the previous month. A man's voice, slurred and certain, talking about breeding and knowing your place and who did and didn't belong at a place like that. The gymnasium got very quiet around the small, tinny sound of it, and then she laid out, plainly, in front of the subcommittee and 400 people, and a reporter from a paper bigger than the regional weekly, the paper trail she'd spent 3 weeks pulling, the Delaware Shell Company, the second shell behind it, the small, last pool of Sterling Vance's money, and the signature on the patent filing that belonged to Preston, the neighborhood association with no members, the UPS box, the fingerprints laid out one beside the next until the shape of the thing was undeniable to anyone with eyes. The room turned slowly and looked at the man in the third row in the good suit. Preston stood up. It was the worst thing he could have done, and he could not stop himself, because a man who has built his whole self out of controlling the room cannot sit still while it gets away from him. He started to talk about due process, about a smear, about how none of this had been proven, and his voice climbed, and the lawyer beside him put a hand on his sleeve and he shook it off. And the more he talked, the more the room saw exactly the thing he had spent his life making sure no one saw, the fear underneath. Naked now, thrashing. He was not undone by Linwood Tate. He was undone, finally, by himself in a school gymnasium, in front of the very people he'd been so sure couldn't throw a stone back. He left before the vote. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word, the same silence that had walked out of Verine Hollow, now walking him out of a middle school, and the doors closed behind him, with the soft bang of a thing finished. The subcommittee approved the permits that night, 11-1. The patent suit was dismissed 6 weeks later, the dormant soul design ruled invalid for prior art that Gwen's lawyers traced, with some satisfaction, to a 1971 Dunmore catalog. Linwood never sued the Vances for any of it. He could have buried them in litigation until the end of the century, and everyone around him expected him to, and he didn't. "They're already broke and already known," he said, when Gwen pushed him on it. "I'm not in the business of stepping on a man who's already on the ground. I'm in the business of building boots. Let's build." The Vances did not recover. The bank took the house in Ladue that winter. Sterling resigned from the boards that hadn't already removed him. Margot left the club, not by choice. Preston moved to another state and went quiet, and the only word anyone ever got of him was secondhand, and there was never, from any of them, a single word of apology. Not to Linwood, not to Camille, not to the neighborhood they'd tried to choke to keep up a performance over a hole. Linwood found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not need the apology. He'd stopped waiting for that kind of thing a long time ago. What he built instead opened the following spring. The Dunmore Trades Fellowship launched with $50 million of Linwood's own money and a charter he wrote most of himself, at the kitchen table with the awl beside him. It wasn't a scholarship in the ordinary sense. It paid full tuition at the trades, yes, but it also paid a living wage during the apprenticeship, so that a young person didn't have to choose between learning a trade and feeding a household. And it did one thing no program like it had done before. It built in a path to ownership. A fellow who finished the program and stayed in the field for 5 years became eligible to buy, on terms a working person could actually meet, an equity stake in one of the Dunmore supplier shops, to own a piece of the thing they helped hold up. The stitch nobody saw would, for once, have its name on the deed. Dante was the first one in. He finished his HVAC certification that fall, took an apprenticeship, through the fellowship, and stood in the front row the day they cut the ribbon on the training center on Dunmore Street, on the lot where Eli Tate had stitched boots for 40 years. It was a cold, bright morning in March, and a couple hundred people had come, and the high-visibility vests in the crowd outnumbered the suits about 4-1, which was the only head count Linwood had ever cared about at an event. Camille's students from the South Side High School had boozed over. 2 of them had helped run conduit in the building over the winter break and stood now with their hands in their pockets, looking up at work they'd done, which is a particular kind of quiet a person doesn't forget. When it came time for someone to say a few words, Linwood didn't. He'd been asked to and had declined. Instead, he found Dante in the front row and handed him the scissors, and the boy looked at him like there'd been a mistake, and Linwood said, "Lo, just for him. You opened the door for me when nobody would. Open this one." So it was a 19-year-old in a brand-new work jacket who cut the ribbon on Dunmore Street, and the old man stood off to the side with his hands folded, watching, the way he'd watched the hawk over the vines a season before, an old man taking the measure of something that knew how to do one thing well. The center had a name over the door, set in plain steel letters, and beside the name, cast in bronze and set into the brick by the entrance where every student would pass it going in, was the shape of an awl. Linwood's father's tool, the worn rosewood, the dull brass collar, scanned and cast and made permanent, no longer a thing one old man carried in his coat pocket but a mark over a door, a thing that now belonged to everyone who walked under it. A private grief turned into a public welcome. Nobody who passed it would know whose hand had worn that handle smooth. That was, Linwood thought, exactly right. The stitch nobody sees. The rest of them landed where people land. Linwood Tate still lives in the small house 6 blocks from where the shop stood. He still drives the F-150, though Camille keeps threatening to have the brakes looked at. He still eats breakfast at the diner on Salisbury, where the waitress still calls him Anan and now knows exactly who he is, and treats him no differently, which is the only reason he still goes. He gives talks sometimes, not at the business schools that started calling after the story got out, but at community eye colleges and trade programs and union halls, where the rooms are full of people with grease under their nails, and his talk is always more or less the same, and it always ends with him holding up a small worn tool and saying something about the stitch nobody sees, and there is also always somebody in that room who has to look at the floor for a minute. Camille still teaches. She wired half the new training center's classrooms herself, with her students as a live lab. She and her father have dinner every Thursday, same diner, same booth, and some weeks they talk for 2 hours, and some weeks they don't say much, and both kinds of weeks are good. She carries the little leather glasses case he made her, the one he never did get to give her at the wedding. He gave it to her at the kitchen table a few days later instead. No ceremony, just slid it across the wood with his coffee, in her bag every day. She told a friend once it reminds her of the difference between being loved and being collected, and that she'd nearly learned it too late. Gwen Price was named Executive of the Year by a magazine that had spent 2 decades pretending she wasn't there. In her acceptance, she talked for about 90 seconds, and most of it was about a man who'd hired her off the line at 19, when nobody else would look twice at a girl with a needle and a chip on her shoulder. And the story got told, the way these stories do now, on a public radio program where people sit across a small table and tell each other true things into a microphone. Camille and her father went in together. Near the end, the host asked Linwood what he'd written on the paper he tucked into the case, and he didn't answer. He just looked at his daughter, and Camille took the folded square out of her bag, soft now at the creases from a year of carrying, and read it aloud in a steady voice, for anybody who happened to be driving home in the dark and listening. If a story like this stirred something in you, if you've ever been the person nobody in the room thought to ask a name, consider subscribing and stay a while. There are more of these to tell. Some nights, Linwood sits at the kitchen table after the dishes are done and turns the awl over in his hands and thinks about his father bent over a boot nobody would ever thank him for, a mouthful of tacks, the radio low. He never did solve the riddle of why some people look at a man and see nothing. He stopped trying. He just kept stitching where it didn't show and trusted it to hold.